The year is 326 BC. The air hangs thick with a humid heat, a suffocating blanket that clings to the skin and mutes the sounds of the camp. The river Hydaspes, a great churning expanse of gray-brown water, lies before them. On the opposite bank, the Indian king Porus awaits with an army of towering war elephants, beasts like living mountains, their great bells clanging, their roars echoing across the water. A lesser man would have hesitated. A king less consumed by the boundless desire for glory would have retreated. But Alexander, king of Macedon, stands on the muddy shore. He surveys the impenetrable line of elephants, the forest of enemy spears, and a flicker of something almost ecstatic passes across his face. He is not looking at an obstacle. He is looking at his destiny and the final, brilliant act of a story that has consumed the known world. This is the moment, not of a final conquest, but of a man at the precipice of his own myth. To understand the myth, one must first understand the man. Alexander was born in 356 BC to a tumultuous and ambitious Macedonian court. His father was Philip II, a king of singular military and political genius. His mother was Olympias, a woman of fiery spirit and deep, almost mystical piety, who claimed her son was a child of the god Zeus himself. From the moment he was born, Alexander's path was not his own. It was a projection of his father's immense ambition and his mother's divine claims. The court at Pella was a crucible of intrigue and danger. Philip, a man of brutal charisma and shrewd pragmatism, transformed a fragmented, semi-barbaric kingdom into the preeminent power in the Hellenic world. He created the finest army of its age, a disciplined, innovative force centered around the pike-wielding phalanx and the elite companion cavalry. While Philip was away at war, a regular state of affairs for the young prince, Alexander was educated by the finest minds of Greece. His most famous tutor was the philosopher Aristotle, who would instill in him a lifelong love of philosophy, medicine, and scientific inquiry. It was said that Aristotle even wrote a special edition of Homer's Iliad for the young prince, a text that Alexander would carry with him on campaign, sleeping with it under his pillow alongside a dagger. He was fascinated by the hero Achilles, an obsession that would shape his own identity and his view of what a truly great man should be. He was a youth of immense promise and even greater contradictions. The famous story of Alexander taming the wild horse Bucephalus demonstrates this perfectly. When the great horse was brought before Philip and his court, it was wild and unmanageable. The king's trainers declared it untamable, but Alexander had seen its fear. He noticed the horse was spooked by its own shadow. He approached the beast quietly, spoke to it, and turned its head towards the sun. The shadow vanished, and the horse was instantly calmed. He mounted the horse and rode it triumphantly. Philip, overwhelmed with pride, is said to have wept. "My son," he exclaimed, "seek a kingdom worthy of yourself. Macedonia is too small for you." This anecdote, perhaps embellished by later historians, captures the essence of the young Alexander. Insightful, fearless, and possessed of a dramatic flair that seemed to prefigure his destiny. The year 336 BC brought an abrupt and violent change. Philip II, having unified Greece under Macedonian hegemony, was assassinated by a member of his own bodyguard. The circumstances remain murky, but it is clear that the fragile peace he had forged hung by a thread. At just 20 years old, Alexander was proclaimed king. The succession was by no means guaranteed. Other claimants, including Philip's infant son by his new wife Cleopatra, presented a threat. Alexander acted with a speed and ruthlessness that shocked many. He had his rival claimants executed, including Cleopatra and her child. It was a chillingly pragmatic act that demonstrated a core truth about him. he would allow nothing to stand in the way of his destiny. His first year as king was a whirlwind of military action. News of Philip's death had triggered rebellions across Greece. The city-state of Thebes, a traditional rival to Macedon, rose in revolt. Alexander marched south with a terrifying swiftness, covering hundreds of kilometers in a matter of weeks. The Thebans, believing he was still in the far north, were taken completely by surprise. After a fierce siege, the city was razed to the ground, its population sold into slavery. The destruction of Thebes was a message, delivered with brutal clarity. Do not question the authority of the new king. It sent a shockwave through the Hellenic world. All of Greece, humbled and terrified, submitted to his rule. Alexander was now the undisputed leader of the League of Corinth, and he was ready to inherit his father's dream, the invasion of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor. He led an army of 40,000 men, a formidable force, but a mere fraction of the Persian Empire's full military might. As he landed, he thrust his spear into the soil and declared that he accepted all of Asia as a gift from the gods. This was not a punitive expedition to punish Persia for its past invasions of Greece, as his father had framed it. This was a war of conquest, and his goal was nothing less than the destruction of the world's great superpower. The first test came swiftly at the river Granicus. A Persian force, consisting of satraps and Greek mercenaries, awaited him. The battle was a chaotic, brutal affair. Alexander led the charge himself, on horseback at the head of his companion cavalry. It was an act of extreme audacity. He was nearly killed, saved only by the intervention of one of his generals, Clytus the Black. The Macedonian cavalry shattered the Persian line, and Alexander ordered a brutal massacre of the Greek mercenaries, seeing them as traitors to the Hellenic cause. The victory at Granicus opened up Asia Minor to his army. City after city fell before him. He made an epic journey from the coast to the interior, where he faced the legendary Gordian knot. An ancient prophecy held that whoever could untie the complex knot would rule all of Asia. Accounts differ on what happened next, but the most common story is that Alexander, frustrated by its complexity, simply drew his sword and sliced through it. The act was a perfect metaphor for his approach to problems: swift, decisive, and unconventional. The true test of Alexander's genius came in 333 BC at the Battle of Issus. Darius III, the King of Kings, had gathered a colossal army. The numbers were staggering, far outnumbering the Macedonians. The battle was fought on a narrow coastal plain, which negated the Persian advantage in numbers. Alexander again led his cavalry in a daring charge, this time directly at the heart of the Persian army, where Darius himself commanded. His aim was not to defeat the Persian army, but to break it by striking at its very head. Panic spread through the Persian ranks as Alexander and his companions carved a path towards Darius's royal chariot. The King of Kings, seeing his bodyguard fall around him, fled the battlefield, leaving his army to collapse in a panicked rout. Alexander's victory was total. He had not only defeated the Persian army, he had humiliated its emperor. In the aftermath, he captured Darius's family, including his mother, wife, and daughters. He treated them with a courtesy and respect that shocked the ancient world, refusing to treat them as plunder. It was an act of a conqueror who saw himself not as a simple victor, but as a new kind of king. The campaign then turned south. Alexander marched along the eastern Mediterranean coastline, securing naval bases to neutralize the Persian fleet. The most formidable challenge was the island city of Tyre, a great fortress that refused to surrender. For 7 months, Alexander's engineers labored to build a causeway to the city under constant attack from Tyrian ships and archers. The siege was a monumental act of engineering and perseverance. When the city finally fell, its population was either killed or sold into slavery. The ruthlessness of this act stood in stark contrast to his treatment of Darius's family, revealing the brutal calculus that underpinned his ambition. He was a man capable of both great magnanimity and utter savagery. His journey led him to Egypt, where he was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule. At the Siwa oasis, he visited the oracle of Amun, the Egyptian counterpart to Zeus. The oracle, it is said, hailed him as the son of the god, a pronouncement that profoundly changed Alexander. He began to believe in his own divinity, a conviction that would grow and would eventually alienate some of his most trusted Macedonian followers. In Egypt, he also founded the city that would bear his name, Alexandria, a new center of culture, commerce, and learning. Having secured his flank, Alexander turned his attention east for the final confrontation with Darius. In 331 BC, the two armies met for the last time on a vast plain near the village of Gaugamela. The Persian army was larger than any he had faced before, with scythed chariots and war elephants from India. Darius had chosen the battlefield carefully, leveling the ground to give his chariots an advantage. But Alexander, ever the tactical genius, devised a new strategy. He feigned a retreat, drawing the Persian cavalry after him, and then, in a perfectly executed maneuver, his phalanx and companion cavalry turned and broke through the Persian center, once again charging directly for Darius. The Persian king, seeing the tide of the battle turn against him, fled for a third and final time. The rest of his army, leaderless and in disarray, disintegrated. The Battle of Gaugamela was the final decisive blow. Darius's empire was shattered. Alexander was now the undisputed master of Asia. He entered the great Persian capitals of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. In Babylon, he was received as a liberator. In Susa, he took possession of the vast Persian treasury. But it was in Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the empire, that his complex character was once again on display. He marched into the city and allowed his men to plunder the palace. Then, in a final act of dramatic retribution, he set fire to the city. The reasons for this act remain debated by historians. Was it a calculated political statement, a final act of revenge for the Persian burning of Athens a century and a half earlier? Or was it, as some accounts suggest, a spontaneous act of drunken rage incited by a Greek courtesan during a banquet? Whatever the cause, the ancient palace, with its soaring columns and magnificent sculptures, was reduced to ashes. It was a symbolic act, the violent end of an age and the beginning of a new one, defined by a conqueror who was now more than a Macedonian king, but the new King of Kings. With Darius's flight, Alexander pursued him through the rugged terrain of Media. He finally found the Persian king murdered, assassinated by his own treacherous satrap Bessus. Alexander, for all his animosity towards Darius, was appalled by the act. He had intended to capture Darius and legitimize his own rule by inheriting the Persian throne. Now he was a conqueror without a clear line of succession. He ordered a relentless pursuit of Bessus, eventually capturing and executing him in a brutal and public spectacle. Alexander began to adopt the trappings of the Persian monarchy, wearing their ceremonial robes and introducing the custom of proskynesis, the act of prostrating oneself before the monarch. For the Macedonians, who were accustomed to a more democratic and free-speaking relationship with their king, this was an unforgivable offense. It was a sign that their king was no longer one of them, but a distant, autocratic ruler who was beginning to believe his own divine propaganda. The strains of unending war and the psychological burden of his new hybrid identity began to show. Alexander's temper, always volatile, grew more unpredictable. In 327 BC, during a drunken banquet, he killed Clytus the Black, the very man who had saved his life at Granicus. Clytus had dared to criticize the king's growing adoption of Persian customs and his deification. Alexander, in a moment of fury, grabbed a spear and ran his old friend through. The act was followed by an agonizing 3-day period of grief and remorse, but the damage was done. The incident revealed a man increasingly isolated by his own power and paranoid about a perceived disloyalty that did not exist. His vision for a new, unified empire, a blend of Greek and Persian cultures, was beginning to alienate the very men who had built it with him. The world he had created was already tearing at its seams. The campaign continued eastward into the rugged, unforgiving lands of what is now Afghanistan and Central Asia. Alexander's armies faced fierce resistance from nomadic tribes and a grueling war of attrition. He established new cities, Alexandrias, to serve as outposts of Hellenistic culture and to maintain control of the conquered territories. One of these cities, Alexandria Eschate, or the furthest, stands as a testament to the sheer scale of his ambition. Here, in the heart of Central Asia, he married Roxana, the daughter of a local noble. The marriage, a significant act of political integration, was deeply unpopular with his Macedonian inner circle. To them, he was marrying a barbarian, further proof that he was abandoning his Greek heritage. In 326 BC, Alexander led his army across the Hindu Kush and into the fertile plains of India. His march was an exploration of the unknown, driven by the desire to reach the ends of the earth and the great outer sea, as he believed the world was shaped. In the Punjab region, he fought his last great battle at the Hydaspes River against the powerful King Porus. Alexander's victory was a masterpiece of military strategy. He feigned a crossing at one location while secretly moving his main force across the river at another. Despite the success, the battle was a bloody affair, and Alexander's beloved horse, Persepolis, died either during the fighting or shortly after. The loss of the horse he had tamed as a boy, a living link to his youth and to his destiny, deeply affected him. After the battle, he treated Porus with his characteristic magnanimity, allowing him to continue to rule his kingdom as a vassal king. The relentless campaign had finally taken its toll. At the Hyphasis River, on the edge of the Ganges basin, Alexander's army mutinied. After 8 years of continuous campaigning, covering thousands of kilometers, his men were exhausted, homesick, and terrified by the prospect of fighting against the vast armies of India. They had heard tales of the immense forces that lay ahead, and their will to continue was finally broken. They refused to march further. Alexander, in a moment of incandescent fury and profound frustration, pleaded with them, he cajoled them, and he threatened them. But the army, for the first time, stood its ground. "I would be glad, brothers," he reportedly said, "if I had all of you standing here next to me, since we are united by the same language, the same blood, and the same visions." It was a plea to their shared identity as Greeks, a return to the unity he had once forged. But it was not enough. He was a king without a kingdom, a general without an army. He retreated to his tent for 3 days, refusing to speak to anyone, a silent and solitary figure, stewing in his own disappointment. In the end, he had to give in. The army turned back. The world's great conqueror had been stopped not by a rival army, but by the sheer human limits of his own men. The long and difficult journey back to the heart of the empire was a testament to both his ambition and his brutality. He divided his forces. One part, led by his admiral Nearchus, sailed down the Indus River and along the coast, a pioneering maritime expedition that charted new territory. The other part, led by Alexander himself, marched through the punishing deserts of Gedrosiah, in what is now southern Iran. The journey was an epic of endurance and suffering. Thousands of men, women, and animals died of heat and thirst. The march was a brutal, punishing ordeal, a stark contrast to the triumphant processions of his earlier conquests. Some historians view it as a needless and self-indulgent act of pride, a king testing the limits of his men in the same way he had tested the limits of the world. Upon his return to the Persian heartland, he faced a new set of challenges. His absence had allowed some of his appointed satraps to grow corrupt and disloyal. He dealt with them with extreme prejudice, executing several for their abuses. He then held a grand set of ceremonies and events, including a mass marriage at Susa, where thousands of his Macedonian soldiers were married to Persian women. The event was a grand spectacle designed to symbolize his vision of a unified empire, a true blending of East and West. But for many Macedonians, it was an offense, a final insult to their heritage and a symbol of their king's complete Orientalization. The fusion of cultures was a magnificent ideal, but it was one that his own men were unwilling to accept. Ruling his vast empire, he was not a man to rest on his laurels. He planned a new series of campaigns, an invasion of Arabia and a circumnavigation of the entire Arabian Peninsula. He was driven by a restless energy, an insatiable curiosity, and a desire for new challenges. He had conquered the known world, and now he was intent on conquering the unknown. His final days, however, were fraught with ill health, bouts of paranoia, and excessive drinking. He was a man worn out by his own relentless pace, his body giving way to the strains of endless war and a life lived at the extremes of human effort. He was just 32 years old. In the spring of 323 BC, he fell ill after a lengthy banquet and a heavy drinking session. His fever grew worse. The sources are maddeningly vague about the cause of his death. Was it poison, as some of his generals suspected? Was it a disease like malaria or typhoid, caught in the tropical climates he had campaigned in? We will likely never know. He lay in a state of fever for days, unable to speak. His soldiers, desperate to see their great king one last time, filed past his bed, a silent procession of men who had followed him to the very edges of the earth. When asked to whom he bequeathed his empire, he reportedly replied, "To the strongest." It was a chilling and prophetic statement. A king who had lived by the sword would leave his world to be torn apart by it. Alexander the Great died on the 10th or 11th of June, 323 BC. The colossal empire he had forged through a decade of unbroken conquest shattered in a matter of years, torn apart by the brutal wars of his successors, the Diadochi. But his legacy was not the empire itself. It was the world he left behind. He was a force of destruction and creation. He tore down the old Persian world, but in its place, he seeded a new one, a Hellenistic world where Greek language, art, philosophy, and ideas spread from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. New cities like Alexandria became great centers of learning and commerce, cultural crossroads where East and West met and mingled. His legend would inspire generals and emperors for 2 millennia, from Hannibal and Julius Caesar to Napoleon. He was the man who cut the Gordian knot, who stood before the world and refused to accept its limits. But standing on the banks of the Hydaspes, facing an army of elephants, Alexander was also a man haunted by the expectations of his father, by the claims of a divine mother, and by a relentless ambition that ultimately devoured him. He was a figure of boundless freedom and terrible sacrifice. Was he, in the end, a god who walked among men, or simply a man who believed too deeply in his own divinity and in his relentless, terrifying ambition? Did he conquer the world, or was he ultimately conquered by it?